All right, everyone. So we are going over the respiratory system anatomy, key structures, some of the physiology as well. You can see I have a diagram of, kind of the head here with the nasal cavity, and then over here, which we'll eventually get to, is the trachea descending into the lungs. These are pinned up against a wall because I move out of my apartment in a week, and I'm not getting my security deposit back. I don't think so. Who cares? Uh, Poorly drawn. You might say it's not that bad. My brother's an actual artist. He would say this is horrible. He would disown me, but that's okay. So what are we starting with? So we're starting with the nares. So, I have air coming in here, but air also goes up here. And so, air will enter in through the opening of the nose, the nares, and will hit first, go into the nasal cavity. And so we know that the nasal cavity has a couple of key structures. So we're going to first talk about the conchae, which I always mispronounce. So you have the superior, middle, and inferior, and then between each conchae, you have the meatus. So you have superior, middle, and inferior. The meatus I've kind of dotted with these little blue lines here, and I'll just be presenting from the kind of back here so you can get a better view. But yeah, so the purpose of the meatus is they separate the conchae and they act as air passages. And then the nasal conchae actually have blood vessels and mucus. So that'll help A, warm the air, and B, moisten the air. So it kind of humidifies it a bit. And there also will be, some particles caught up in the nasal cavity due to the creation, or not to the creation, but due to the kind of setup of it, which is pseudostratified columnar epithelium and cilia, which can kind of move foreign substance in and out, kind of acts as a first line of defense. Then we can get into the pharynx. So we know the pharynx has three structures. We're going to start with the nasopharynx. And again, important to remember, pharynx is just carrying air between the nasal cavity and the larynx. So, and it's also immunity protection too, which we know, it has some tonsils, which I've drawn in one of the tonsils here. The palatine tonsil would be more so up here. But we're going to start here. So this is the auditory tube, and then this is the nasopharynx. So nasopharynx only acts as an air passageway. It's ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, as opposed to the oropharynx, which is this blue portion I've shaded, which is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. So the oropharynx is much more robust, can handle abrasion, and therefore it acts as a passageway for air and food, which is similar to the laryngopharynx. I always struggle with that word. If I look at it too long, it freaks me out. And it's lined with stratified squamous epithelium, and it also acts as a passageway for air and food. So again, a bit more robust. And then, I've also, this would be, so if you, detach the shield kind of covering portion, this would be an internal view of the larynx, but this is the larynx itself. And so we know the larynx is going to help out carrying air between the pharynx and the trachea, also with sound production. So the vocal cords are hidden behind the structure, which we'll get to in a second. And also features vestibular folds, so muscles that essentially just protect the airway by preventing food from entering the trachea. Again, we'll get into that right now because we have the larynx, and the larynx is going to have three important cartilage structures. So one, it has the epiglottis, which I didn't do a great job. I probably should have made it a little more prominent here. But essentially the epiglottis is like a fold that would be right along here. And it is the uppermost portion of cartilage that's elastic. Like I said, it contains vestibular folds, and it mainly helps prevent food from entering the glottis. So it directs air into the glottis, and then it'll direct ingested material into the esophagus. So very important kind of split there. And then the other thing you're going to get into is the thyroid cartilage, which is the Adam's apple, which is essentially the shield-like looking component, this middle component right here. Like I said, I detached larynx so you can see it better, and that's going to contain hyaline cartilage and surrounds the vocal cords. So kind of a protective covering. And then you're going to get into the cricoid cartilage, which is the bottom portion, and this is where the larynx connects to the trachea. It's hyaline, and so you can see that kind of connection happening right here, and we can actually move you to the next video, and if you can see that, well, which I think you can from there, we have the trachea. And so I didn't want to draw out a bazillion C-shaped rings, but just know that trachea, essentially synonymously known as the windpipe, connects the larynx to the bronchial tree, very rigid, supported by the C-shaped rings, which you'll see. And that's gonna split again. So it's gonna bifurcate at the distal ends into the right bronchi, which is the primary bronchi on the right, and the left bronchi, primary bronchi on the left. So now we're getting into the bronchial tree, which is essentially the network of air tubes that are going to carry air in and out of the lungs. I didn't draw the lungs themselves, but just know they'd be surrounded here. We know right side 3 lobes, left side 2 lobes. But yeah, so now we're in the bronchial tree. Larger pathways are going to have hyaline, smaller pathways are going to have smooth muscle. And what does that look like? So first, you, like I said, primary bronchi right, primary bronchi left. Then you're gonna go into the lobar bronchi. So you'll have the right lobar bronchi, the left lobar bronchi, and those essentially bring air into each lobe of the lung. So lobar, think lobe. I think that one's pretty straightforward. And then those lobes actually are then going to split into segmental bronchi. So these, the SB noted here, and those would be, you know, kind of these, again, distal ends right here. Those are the segmental bronchi. So again, further splitting of the lobar bronchi to provide even more area for air to go in, CO2 to go out, gas exchange to continue. And then to zoom in even more, which, you know, I know Paul mentioned it's microscopic, and I'm going to actually pull that in so you can see this even more. So this is, if we zoomed in on the segmental bronchi, you'd have a bronchiole. So this is a continuation of the segmental bronchi, no longer features supportive cartilage. So this is where we're transitioning to smooth muscle. And this is going to have ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, transitioning actually into ciliated cuboidal epithelium. So that's an important thing to know. And that's happening in the bronchiole. And the bronchioles are actually going to split into terminal bronchioles, which branch from the bronchioles. That's again smooth muscle. So we're in the smooth muscle phase with cilia, and they no longer have goblet cells. So once you're kind of getting into this terminal bronchiole section, there's no more mucus production. And those are the last branch of air ducts that are going to act solely as a passageway. And then we get into the respiratory bronchiole, which, so bronchiole, terminal bronchiole, respiratory bronchiole, which I've shaded in yellow. Terminal is in orange, bronchiole is in blue. So we're now in the respiratory bronchiole. And again, those are going to branch from the terminal bronchiole. So again, another sub-branch, and they no longer feature smooth muscle or cilia. So again, we're getting even kind of more minimalistic, if you will. And this is where you will find the alveoli, which is, I'd argue, one of the most, if not the most important structure within the lungs. These are microscopic air sacs. So this is where they're found at the end of respiratory bronchioles, and this is where the primary gas exchange is going to occur in the lungs. So that'll be where CO2 and O2 is exchanged. Again, extremely important area, microscopic, but I've kind of zoomed in so you can see it. And each end of the bronchioles are going to have like millions of alveoli. So a ton of different alveoli. I kind of just only do the little ones on there. But yeah, that's the main site of gas exchange. And those alveoli are going to be either squamous alveolar cells, great alveolar cells, or alveolomacrophages. So yeah, the squamous alveolar cells are mainly going to be focused on gas exchange. That's most important. But the great alveolar cells, those will have surfactant, which is the lipoprotein that's going to help them prevent sticking to themselves and help them re-expand. And then those macrophages, the alveolar macrophages, will just kind of clean things up there. So yeah, and again, each of these alveolar cells will have a respiratory membrane, which allows that gas exchange to take place. So yeah, apologies for the poor drawings. This video probably went on a little too long, but yeah, hopefully this helps you guys. I know it kind of helped me to talk it through. Good luck, everyone.